Will the government now step in over Prince Andrew?
It would be a big call, I think, for the government to say, we're taking this from being a matter led by the royal family to now the government leading on this issue.
Prince Andrew has lost his dukedom, his titles, and long ago any kind of reputation, but the questions continue. Prince William's former right-hand man, Simon Case, is here to discuss.
Somebody somewhere has to establish the facts first, which is what is going on here, what material is out there. And at the moment, I mean, that's the thing that if I was still in any of my jobs, I would still be very nervous about.
Lord Case went from the palace to Parliament as Cabinet Secretary until last year.
People ask me, do I miss it? And I say, I do not miss this at all. I look at what's been going on just in the last few weeks. I am so pleased I do not wake up in the morning anymore, and that is my problem.
He has chilling predictions on China's future influence and power.
I think China is it's undoubtedly a threat.
And he takes us behind the scenes at number 10.
Downing Street under David Cameron in that coalition era was probably the last time Downing Street felt functional.
Hello and welcome to Talking Politics. I'm Tom Bradby.
And I'm Robert Peston, and we're delighted to be joined by Sir Simon Case, who until quite recently was the most powerful civil servant in the UK as Cabinet Secretary. Before that, he had a few years working for the Paris would be
Paris
news.
Anyway,
I would like to have spent my time in Paris.
Anyway, you've been in and out of the highest positions in public services for pretty much your entire career, and therefore, unsurprisingly, at this particular juncture, there's quite a lot we need to talk to you about. And Tom, you're going to kick off.
Well, I was thinking, you've worked for pretty much everyone, just so the audience has some context. You worked, as Private Secretary to David, you correct me if I'm wrong with any of this, but Private Secretary to David Cameron and Theresa May, then Private Secretary, that's most senior official, to Prince William, then briefly Permanent Secretary in Downing Street to Boris Johnson, and then Cabinet Secretary, the head of the civil service, most senior person in government, to Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, Rishi Sunak, and Keir Starmer. In other words, you've been the right-hand man.
You've seen the chaos at first hand.
Every single senior person in the British.
I'm the sort of common theme through.
You're
the golden thread.
It's all down to me. Yeah, thanks.
Well, listen, when we sort of you were coming in, we didn't think we'd be starting talking about the royal family, but we probably do because it's dominating the news this week. You used to work for Prince William. I don't think we'll be revealing anything on this podcast when we say that. I don't think either of us think he's Prince Andrew's biggest fan. If you were there in either role, what would you be advising the royal family or the government to do? What do you think they can do?
Yeah, well, I was there actually working in the palace when there was the first statement made about the then Duke of York. And I think the move that the family, led by the King, were led to sort of understand he sort of led this personally, it's the right response at this moment. I think they've thrown everything that they've got at this now. Judged the mood correctly, as you say. People are very, very angry about this, and I think clearly every day we see more about the experience of the victims of Epstein, who, I mean, so often sort of get forgotten in this story. We rush on to the politics or the focus on these, big names, but actually, the victims lie at the heart of this, and obviously we're now reading every day about some of the internal dialogue and feelings of these victims. So I think the palace has got this right, which is, they've done everything they can, remove the titles and all that sort of thing.
Well, hang on, but they haven't actually removed the titles. They've just got an understanding from Andrew that he's not going to use them.
We'll get straight into the sort of constitutional aspects. You're right. You can sort of go legally further.
And there are quite a lot of MPs who are saying that whether it's led by the Palace or led by Downing Street, that they should go that bit further and put through the Act of Parliament that would strip him formally of the titles. I mean, there's even a suggestion, because apparently there is some device that would remove his ability to call himself a prince as well.
Yeah, it's obviously there as an option, as you say. There are clearly a number of MPs, I think, from the SNP, and I think one or two independents sort of come out saying this matters. I mean, this is where it becomes a sort of judgment for the government, which is whether whether the government wants to take time out of the government's programme of passing legislation to focus on this. That's a call. I think the government's been pretty clear about this, which is it's taking its lead from the palace. I think the palace view is, we've done everything we can. We go beyond this, and all of a sudden you're saying, well, okay, let's not spend time on planning reform. Let's not spend time on illegal migration, and let's spend time on the constitutional questions around the prince. I personally, I'd be surprised if the government decided to sort of halt its legislative programme to focus on this.
But come on. A bill of this sort, it's going to take 5 minutes. There'll be complete unanimity in the Commons. Nobody's going to block it or oppose it. It'll just go through on the nod.
So I think what's interesting about this is it could do, but there are some parliamentarians in both houses who for a long time have wanted to open up all sorts of questions around the Act of Succession, around the operation of the finances around the royal family. Particularly in the chamber that I sit in, the Lords, we quite like adding things to bills. It seems so.
I think
it would be a big call. I think for the government to say it's now we're taking this from being a matter led by the royal family to now the government leading on this issue.
Now, we should be clear. Prince Andrew has consistently denied, the allegations made by Geoffrey, but he still handed over, many millions of pounds to her. There is a sort of view in Westminster and Whitehall that, whether what comes out is true or not true, but there is other stuff. Right, just to be clear, that the rumours and the gossip about what Andrew has done is sort of never-ending, right? And there is an argument for saying that if what we have is essentially a voluntary decision not to use titles, actually, it is still completely legitimate for anybody who wants to spend half a career digging up stuff about him just to go on and do it. And, the stories will just keep on coming unless and until he is basically totally thrown out of the family.
We should say also that he did not, legally we have to say he did not admit liability when he handed over that money. But, to add to Robert's point, then we'll let you come back. I guess part of the overall picture is, you've got Ghislaine Maxwell being let out of a high security prison and put in an open prison. There's very little sense that the powerful men who abuse these young girls have ever really been punished or made to pay the price of it. You've got that on the one side, this sense that the girls themselves, and every time any of us, as you said quite rightly at the start, every time any of us listen to their testimony, it's horrifying, and the way these men have got away with it. And
I think, and there's a related point as well, which is, he sort of indicated, although I think it was always a bit ambiguous, that he would be happy to cooperate with investigations into Epstein, but it's never happened. And again, do we really believe, absent him actually, essentially providing evidence on what he witnessed? Because one thing that is absolutely clear is he spent an awful lot of time with this evil man, and so he would be a very valuable source of information about this monster.
Yeah, I think these are that's one of the things that really lies at the heart of this. As you said, there's all the things you sort of have to say about, quite rightly, about sort of the legal disclaimers and all of this sort of thing. The problem is that there's still a lot of uncertainty that lies at the heart of this story. We have sort of material being published posthumously. Clearly there's material in the hands of Congress, which is, presumably going to, more of that will come out. We've got we've got, Prince Andrew with his consistent denials, settling I think it was a civil case, wasn't it, with no liability. I mean, there's still an enormous amount that we don't know. And actually, Tom, you sort of started with what would my advice be in either government or palace. And actually, this, I think, is the biggest problem, which is what is out there. I mean, you get this over and over again. I think, perhaps lots of your, listeners will have, lived with politics over many years and seen examples of good crisis management and bad crisis management, both in a kind of policy and in a communication sense. And nearly always it starts with somebody somewhere has to establish the facts first, which is what is going on here, what material is out there. And at the moment, I mean, that's the thing that if I was still in any of my jobs, I would still be very nervous about, which is we've got to get our arms around what is here.
So that's a precise point that I wanted to put to you, right? So let's just say that you were in that role you held of cabinet secretary. One of the things about Andrew is he was trade envoy for quite a long time. He effectively worked, with the government, used lots of government resources. If you were in, if you were essentially running, would you be advising the Prime Minister, we have got to find out absolutely everything about his role for the government because other people will be crawling all over it, and if we don't know what the hell he did.
That's a massive job, isn't it? Well, that's a massive job. What went on in Kazakhstan or wherever, I mean, that would be an internal inquiry would have to last about 3 years to get to the bottom of it.
I mean, I think you're right. There would be a lot of work, although I would think over the years, as it were, this file has probably been pulled together. I can't quite remember. Suggesting that I've seen such a thing.
If you remember before the end of the programme, do share.
Simon, just quickly, you brought the file with you. You're opening it as we speak.
But I mean, getting this position of, we cannot deal with this issue unless we understand what more is out there and how it's going to unfold. And it will involve a lot of work. But to sort of borrow sort of the sporting analogy, point is the levels of anger are very high, the quite rightly sympathy for the victims. You've got this drip, drip, drip of information. You've got Parliament asking perfectly reasonable questions for Parliament about, well, what's our role in all of this? And at the moment, at the heart of it is this uncertainty. So yeah, I think if I wouldn't be surprised. I do not know this. This is not an exclusive. Yeah. I would not be surprised if somebody somewhere in government isn't saying, could somebody just get out all of the files on, everything we've got, about, Prince Andrew's interactions with government, so that we can answer questions that Parliament will rightly ask, and the public will ask of us.
You obviously advise Prince William. So I guess two questions around that. Like, imagining you are still in that role, it's been pretty clear from all the briefing, the kind of consistent briefing is Prince William, there's absolutely no affection, to put it mildly, for his uncle. I mean, I think we all know that that's true. Do you see Prince William as being kind of the prime mover in removing his uncle's, or removing the use of his uncle's titles? And if you were sort of sitting there advising him now, would you be saying, listen, you've got to go all the way on this because my instinct is this is going to get worse?
So I'd be surprised if he were the prime mover. Okay. And that's not sort of, as it were, inside knowledge about how things... It's just a reflection on... It's the top of the shop, it's the lead, it's the sovereign who takes the lead on these issues. There is a hierarchy. Yeah, I mean, it's a family, and, like all families, everybody, I'm sure, has opinions and what have you. But actually, the king is the sovereign, and it's for him and his team to sort of take the lead. So, I'd be amazed if Prince William directly or his team weren't sort of being consulted on all of this. I'd be amazed if that weren't happening, because these are big family questions and institutional questions. But it is very much, just as it was when the then sort of Duke of York first made his statement, it was the Queen, it was the late Queen who led that because, she's the boss at that moment. Right now, the King is the boss, so the King and his team lead. But knowing how the Prince and Princess of Wales sort of are as people, I'm sure they will be reaching out to sort of Prince William's cousins, because they will be thinking that there are other sort of the daughters are sort of mixed up in this as well. The Prince and Princess of Wales have consistently been people who have one of their big sort of themes that they keep coming back to, of course, especially in the last couple of years, given everything the family's been through, is thinking about sort of mental health. And I would be very surprised if they weren't thinking about the formerly York daughters, sort of, hold on, how are they holding up?
It must be awful for them. I can't even imagine
reading
what it'd be like to be a child in
reading
these
all this stuff about your father is...
Yeah.
You were private secretary to Prince William. You lived through the whole Megxit, and
I went from Brexit to Megxit.
Yeah, and we don't possibly need to go into the ins and outs of how that impacted both of us. But you had that job, which was sort of extraordinary. Then you working for David Cameron, Theresa May, that was extraordinary. Then Boris Johnson. You've just done so. And I had a question before we get on to the other substance of it. Did you enjoy it all? Or did you enjoy some of it more than others? Or did you just not think about it? Because it's incredibly interesting, but sometimes not that fun and potentially very stressful.
I said very rarely was it fun dealing with these things. Dealing with Brexit, and from that to going into the working in the royal family, and that was supposed to be
sedate,
a fun look at a different part of the opportunity to be involved in shaping the next, working with the next generation of this ancient institution, and then came back to government, left the palace to come back to government because of COVID, and then COVID into Ukraine, and then political crises alongside. That's all pretty miserable stuff to deal with. Why do you do it? Well, one is because, you're there and it's sort of your job in the moment, and it does matter. The public sector is far from perfect, and we made many mistakes. There are some amazingly sort of talented people that come and choose to work either in the political sphere, or in the civil service, or in the armed forces, or the police, or the NHS. You get to work with some extraordinary people. And people ask me, do I miss it? And I say, I do not miss this at all. I look at what's been going on. I am so pleased I do not wake up in the morning anymore, and that is my problem to solve. I really don't, and I wish nothing but sort of goodwill to those whose jobs it is now. But I do really miss the people that you work with. COVID was awful. Day in, day out, we'd come to work, and the first thing we'd look at is deaths and infections and whatever. But I got to work day in, day out with Chris Whitty and Patrick Vallance, two outstanding public servants. At the palace, I worked with some amazing people who will not thank me for naming them publicly. But that's sort of what gets you through.
Do you think, looking back on it, you got it a few years too young?
Definitely. I've described it over and over again as a battlefield promotion. It was totally unique to the circumstances of a combination of messes that had happened. Sort of both COVID, but also internally, sort of breakdown in relations between the Johnson government and the civil service. So, definitely, if I'd had that job, ordinarily maybe I would have been. Funny enough, it's not a job that I actually ever particularly wanted. In sort of normal run-of-the-mill circumstances, I might have been considered for that job maybe 10 years later.
I wanted to ask you two big questions, and I thought I'd ask you them both in one, in a way. Sort of firstly, how much of an enemy do you think China is? Subclause would be every single politician I ever remember. I was based in Hong Kong when Tony Blair came and said he thought, China was moving towards greater democracy and respect for human rights. successive political leaders didn't necessarily say that, but, it was all like, we're going to do trade, blah, blah, blah. Things are moving in the right direction. So I guess my question is, how much, right today now, how much of an enemy do you think China is? And, the question which somewhat goes with it is, how much of a friend do you think America is? And, there is a view that what's happening in America, the scapegoating of your political enemies, the cracking down on media organizations, is a sort of a fairly rapid drift towards authoritarianism, and some people are terrified that eventually you'll have, states of emergency declared and elections cancelled, and other people say that's just liberal hyperbole. So I guess, in simple terms, how much of an enemy is China and how much of a reliable friend is America?
Yeah, well, I am one of those people, having sort of grown up in the national security world, that's been most of my career. I think China is a very, it's undoubtedly a threat. That is the right way to describe China. Just have a look at what the head of MI5 said in his speech last week, and he and his counterparts across the other intelligence agencies in their annual public outings. Look at how they've been describing China. They have a voracious security and intelligence apparatus, which has been operating sort of around the world. But beyond that, but let's be clear about what is happening. The coming century is likely to be the Chinese century. It is an enormous economic and growing military power now,
and technological,
and of course all of these. It's everything, and in military terms, most of us have lived big chunks of our lives where it was either America and the Soviet Union, or more recently just America, that was the sort of the mightiest military power. China is now at least equal to the United States. Well, why is that a problem? Well, actually look at how China operates. Like many powerful nations through the history of mankind, it has imperial ambitions. Look at the way, if your listeners don't know about it, go away and look up the Belt and Road Initiative. It's the way that China's been operating now for the last couple of decades, of spreading its influence, of seizing critical mineral rights, which are now hitting our newspapers again, because China is starting to sort of play its access to the minerals that are essential, and these sort of materials that are essential to making our phones work. They're restricting the supply
to America, and that is economic warfare. Yeah.
This is a nation that has been thinking long and hard,
right.
as of course you can do
right,
when you don't have to face elections.
But can I just, because I think there is a definitional issue when you talk about imperialism, right? So most of us believe that they will probably in 2027 invade Taiwan.
Well, because the president of China has made public remarks telling everybody to get ready.
Do you think they'll do it?
I think that they will definitely do either it will be invasion or it will be a blockade. So during the next few years, the squeeze on Taiwan is coming, and it will cause us a huge problem globally.
And almost certainly in 2027, because they like anniversaries, and that is the centenary of the creation of the People's Army. Now, but to be clear, we should understand that for China and for the government of China, and for Xi in particular, this is a very particular thing. They have simply never recognized the independence of Taiwan. They regard Taiwan as theirs. Mm-hmm. And all they're doing is basically taking back something that's theirs. That's what they would say, mm-hmm. right? Now, there will be an enormously, for Trump, for us, this is going to be a massive moment, and it's not that far off how we respond.
It will affect everybody in the UK in their daily lives.
Yeah, it's going to be massive. How we respond is going to be, it's going to be probably more momentous, certainly because of the economic impact of all of this, than the sanctions regimes post Ukraine, which led to, as this massive surge in energy prices, which affected all our living standards. But the kind of blockades that could be put in place might mean that quite a lot of manufacturing will have to close.
The last time I saw an assessment of the economic impact, it was estimating the impact of invasion in Taiwan and consequences will be COVID plus Ukraine combined and a bit more.
Yeah. So we're talking about a potentially
Something to look forward to
massive,
in a world where we're feeling really cheery.
Bringing you
Simon,
good news every week.
So we're talking about potentially massive economic shock, not that far off. But, and this is the distinction that I wanted to make, right? They would argue what they're doing with Belt and Road, for example, it's not like Britain basically actually creating a formal empire where these territories are British. They are creating a sort of economic dependence, which I have to say is definitely bad for us, right? But it is Chinese imperialism is very different from the kind of imperialism that we practiced or the French practiced, or and I think I'm not saying it makes it any less pernicious for the rest of the world, particularly since they are an anti-democratic surveillance society, right? But they would argue, which I think, just to be clear, I'm not an apologist for China.
I was going to say, you're doing a great PR act.
No, I'm not an apologist.
I'm
I'm not an apologist for China. I am simply saying that if we are, look, for years, right? So when Dave and George, Cameron and Osborne, hailed this golden era of relations with China, I said to them, have you actually talked to any British business about relations with China over the last 20 years? Because basically they will tell you they have been stealing all their intellectual property with no protection from the British government. And one of the reasons China is such a formidable economic power is because of the theft from the West, right? Which went on for years and years and years, right? And so, look, it is possible that the invasion of Taiwan is a stepping stone to sort of German style 1930s Lebensraum. We just got to build protection all the way around us and invade absolutely everywhere around us. That is possible, right? But I just think we have to be realistic now that what this is mostly about is economic security and a leader, a dictator. So in your view, are we talking about other invasions, or are we just talking about essentially economic control with their version of creating economic dependence, as it were?
So I don't agree it's just about economic dependence. Because
I was asking. I wasn't saying that was absolutely the case. I'm asking a question.
When you look at the Belt and Road Initiative, it is creating economic coercive control over critical assets inside other countries, and often that is followed by military footprint as well inside those countries. So China may actually create its empire, as I would call it, fulfill its imperial ambitions through a combination of its sort of economic bow wave followed by creating military footprint. But we should be clear about what that means. And I sort of struggle with this idea that because we once had an empire, which many people in this country around the world feel very uneasy about our history, that somehow we should allow, we should sort of say, well, it's sort of China's turn. I don't think.
I certainly wasn't making that argument.
I mean, China is a country which exists in the minds of many of its leaders to perpetuate the control of the Chinese Communist Party. Yeah. They do not have free and fair elections. It's an incredibly nationalistic country as well. And what I say is, it's spreading its influence around the world through economic means and then military is, however the Chinese explain that is bad news for those of us who live in countries that value democracy, that think, especially a nation like the United Kingdom, which is completely reliant on global free trade. That's why, that's how it's how we are where we are as a country. Is we have been an open, free trading country, and you think that, a China whose sort of influence spreads around the world. You look at that will be bad news for people on the streets of the United Kingdom.
I should just point out before you say that, though, to be clear, the biggest enemy to free trade at the moment is not China, it's Trump. And I think we should be clear about that.
Well, can I ask you about that aspect of it? How worried are you about the basic health of democracy in the US?
It's very difficult to watch what's going on in the United States and not be sort of very worried about what's going on in a country that so many of us, lots of people know. They would have been on holiday. I've spent lots of my career sort of working very closely with Americans, and you think, gosh, what's happening? Is this turning into a country that we don't recognise? I actually do have faith in the long-term health of the key institutions inside the United States. I'm not as alarmist, that this is a turning point. The Constitution's going to be rewritten. There are some very, very important obstacles which, thankfully, the Founding Fathers put in the way should any American president want to. The states' rights, the states that make up the United States are incredibly powerfully sort of locked in their role into the Constitution. So even should a president, want to start meddling with the Constitution, there are lots of sort of locks and checks and balances, and those institutions. And also, look, there's always sort of point and counterpoint in all of this. You remember a couple of months ago, everybody was reporting about, is President Trump going to fire the Fed chair and all of this sort of thing? It got to a peak, and then all of a sudden it died away, and we read that, just as happened over many decades, the key figures in Wall Street come along and say actually, that is not in the United States.
It's not over yet. Simon, just be clear, that is not over, that battle. That will come back.
It may not be, but one of the things we have to be first of all, the thing we learnt in President Trump's first term was it was actually very difficult to tell what was being said and would be carried out and what was being said that just sort of disappeared as fast as it was put up. And I think we have to, that's how we have to keep reading things. President Trump's sort of role in peace in sort of between Israel and Gaza over the last few weeks, everyone's been talking about, gosh, it turns out his highly unpredictable nature seems to be at the heart of actually having sort of landed that.
The one thing we can agree on is we've seen Trump and, to some extent his acolytes like Stephen Miller, like running roughshod over things that are not constitutional laws, but they are norms, whether it's browbeating media organizations or prosecuting your political enemies or all the rest of it. And what Robert and I have talked about is a populist leader of the left or right who got into power and managed to win a parliamentary majority in Britain. You're a guy who's literally sat at the heart of the British establishment, if you want to call it that. How robust do you think our system would be if somebody came in determined to push it to the max and to, really ride roughshod over norms?
I think our system is actually much more vulnerable than the US system.
Interesting. Why?
Because of the winner-takes-all nature of our parliamentary democracy. Yeah. For all of the flaws in the US Constitution, and they are there, the Founding Fathers actually put some real limits on the power of the president and the executive. Very clearly, you have your executive branch, you have the legislative branch, you have Congress, and you have your judges. If President Trump loses control of either house at the midterms, which are coming up, huge moment in this presidency, all of a sudden, President Trump starts to find himself being regularly blocked in Parliament. In Congress. Don't forget, he's currently, even with in theory, control over both houses at the moment. He can't get what he wants in terms of the budget bill through, which is why you've got this shutdown of government spending in the United States, which is, comes back to those checks and balances. Here, a country with an unwritten constitution, get a big majority in Parliament, you take control of Parliament, you can pass whatever laws that you like, assuming that your whips are sort of making your MPs go through the right lobbies for you. That's enormous power that you have here. I remember spending many, many happy hours as a PhD student sort of talking about the United Kingdom's unwritten constitution. And back then, 25 years ago, we were talking about the strengths of the flexibility, the inherent flexibility. This is amazing. I find myself now an advocate for a written constitution in the United Kingdom.
Good luck with that.
Because of sort of what I've seen here and what I've seen elsewhere.
Right. I mean,
I think it is probably time.
Given the fragmentation of support for political parties, it is now way more than a theoretical possibility that somebody can get, won't name names, but 30% of the vote and have a very significant majority in the House of Commons, and that would effectively mean fewer than 1 in 5. You could have a situation where something like 15% of British people effectively create an elected dictator, because the thing about being PM, if you've got a big majority in the House of Commons, you can pretty much do what you like.
It is extraordinary what you can do with that power, and that's sort of why I say I'm actually, if you look at the theory and the practice, I'm a little bit more worried about the UK. At the same time as having said what I've just said about the amount of power in a Prime Minister's hands with a big majority in this country, consistently over, actually it was started under Thatcher, over the decades since, more and more political power in this country has actually been given away to, quangos and other departments or agencies or entities which don't have ministers or sort of democratically elected people in charge of them. And I think that's equally a big problem at the moment. And I've said this publicly, in this country, there's a great danger that you vote for change at the ballot box, but because the power still lies in the hands of sort of people who don't change. People vote for change, but they don't then get it, and that's an equally sort of difficult problem for us. So I think we're in this to get this right over the next 20 years. There is a very thin sort of tightrope that we need to walk sort of constitutionally here, and I'm afraid it sort of is one of my obsessions.
No, I think you're completely right about it, and I think this whole issue of, essentially what should be political decisions being delegated to, so-called arm's length regulators and agencies, I think is a huge problem. But I was quite struck, obviously part of my daily reading is Civil Service World, and
come on, that's the confession of the month.
We found the subscriber.
Anyway,
free copy in the post.
Yeah. You had a conversation with Civil Service
Service. You knew it was
World.
true.
You had a conversation in Civil Service World in which you said that actually your happiest time working in Downing Street was working with Dave and George as a younger official, when I presume you were the Prime Minister.
I was the Private Secretary to David. Yeah.
And patently, I don't just mean actually, I think let's just bring it right up to date, okay, rather than talking about your time with Boris. Okay, we can talk about that another time. But just bring it right up to date. It's been patently obvious that Downing Street has not been a happy place since Labour won the election. And I'm just interested to know what made Downing Street a happy, effective place during the coalition, right? And here we've got Starmer with an enormous majority, but it's been pretty dysfunctional and not very, and actually patently very unhappy. So what was the difference?
Interesting question.
Really, really important question. And I think Downing Street under David Cameron in that coalition era was probably the last time Downing Street felt functional. As you then went into May and Brexit and and all of that, and then then onwards. What made that time so important was a few things. One was actually very boring organisational stuff, but roles and responsibilities were very clearly defined. Each person knew what they were doing, You knew, okay, I'm leading on this. I know who I've got to talk to get this decision taken before we go to the Prime Minister. So actually there was real clarity inside the team. Anybody, will know that if you work in an organisation where nothing's really defined, you're constantly tripping all over each other. The second thing is the culture, and this came from David Cameron personally. It really mattered to him that his team got along. That doesn't mean they didn't sort of disagree about should we do this or do that, but it was a sort of a high trust. People respected each other, people were polite to each other. Of course, I came in 2012, so I know that wasn't necessarily always the case, because I wasn't there when, for example, Steve Hilton was there, and lots was written about the difficulties in that time. So I sort of came in 2012 onwards. And so it was an atmosphere of sort of trust and respect amongst the people that worked for David, and he led that personally. That people treated each other professionally and properly.
So leadership from a Prime Minister really matters.
Yeah, it definitely does. There was also something else about David as a Prime Minister. I guess it sounds like I'm turning into some weird Cameron fan club. I mean, there were many people who scream and shout at their earphones on this and say, but isn't he the guy who led to us leaving the EU and all that sort of stuff? But he was a very good decision maker. Very rarely did he come back and say, oh, I'd like more information, or I don't, He knew if the decision has got to the Prime Minister's desk, it probably means all of the easy options have been ruled out. There isn't any more information, because somebody else would have dealt with it if it was that clear.
Okay.
And so he, as Prime Minister, really understood, and he also understood, which is sometimes very difficult, that once you've made a decision, you've got to push that through. There are one or two other features, which is, as you said, it was coalition. So interestingly, there were structures in place that made clear that everything you had to be very clear when you were making a decision that this would work politically.
Okay.
So the fact that every Monday morning, first proper meeting of the day, David Cameron would sit down with Nick Clegg, Deputy Prime Minister, leader of the Liberal Democrats, and they'd say, these are the decisions we need to take. What do you think? Bang, bang, bang. I can take my lot with me. Can you take your lot with me? Yeah, right, okay. Now we'll announce it. Now we'll go public. Those disciplines of actually having to, it sounds odd, you'd think surely before you announce anything in government, you've thought through the politics. If only you did. But those mechanisms in the coalition actually forced it to be in quite a disciplined
environment. And then if I could just ask one follow-up very briefly.
I think we've got to let Simon go.
We have got to let go, but obviously this is the question that anyone listening to this. But I think this is the question that people will be asking themselves when they hear this, which is, you are holding the ring after the general election. You are Cabinet Secretary for quite a few months after that. You will have explained all this to Keir Starmer. Why has it been so dysfunctional? Why have there been so many rivalries? Why hasn't there been this sense of people, essentially operating in a collegiate way rather than as rivals and without a clear sense of direction?
I've asked myself this sort of question a lot too, unsurprisingly. And I go back to that Cameron era. They had a very settled team in opposition for quite a few years before they came in. A lot of these patterns of behaviour, culture, way decisions were taken, were actually established in opposition. And then I go back and I look at sort of those years running up to the general election. You'd had a leadership change, very sort of bitter disputes and very unpleasant times inside the Labour Party. Actually, you look at how regularly, as leader of the opposition, sort of Keir Starmer rotated through his team.
Yeah.
They didn't actually come into government with a settled team. And it was quite clear, I think, at the beginning that they didn't know who was where. And then, of course, to be honest, once you've come into government, it is so hard to establish those boring things like roles and responsibilities and cultures, because the tsunami of things that hit you, all of a sudden you're feeling constantly behind the curve, as they say. Yeah. And so in the heat of battle, it's really difficult to forge your team. And I think you look at many of the basics, loads of new MPs. So even though you have a huge majority, lots of your MPs...
You don't even know these people.
You don't necessarily know them. And you think, great, we're going to be fiscally responsible, we're going to keep tight control on the money, good welfare cuts coming. And then you think, oh, heck, turns out we can't get this through our people in Parliament because they haven't established all of these relationships and all that sort of thing. And as I say, it's very difficult to do once you're in government.
It's been very good of you to give up your time. I feel we need to let you out. So
It was
our prisoner
fascinating.
it was fascinating.
It was absolutely fascinating.
So thank you very, very much
insightful.
indeed. We really appreciate it. Simon Case, thank you very much. And it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from me.